Hello, I'm Suzanne Smith. The Florida Book Awards gave their 2014 gold medal for general nonfiction to a book that focuses on a woman who changed the way people understand and study the history of women and of the world. Merlin Stone Remembered is the name of the book. It has not one, but 3 authors: David B. Axelrod, who is an editor and award-winning author in his own right, Carol F. Thomas, who is also a poet and expert on the women's movement, and Lenny Schneir, who is Merlin Stone's life partner for 34 years. Thank you all for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Tell me how each of you came to know Merlin, because you all did it in a different way. David, why don't we start with you?
Well, I actually did teach as a college professor, and I would see Merlin Stone's book being carried by, as often it was women taking women's studies programs. I myself am a poet, but I also taught comparative religion and mythology, and it was perhaps indicative of the patriarchal view of that subject matter that I didn't actually know or use Merlin's book myself in classes. But I would have enjoyed knowing Merlin. I got to know Lenny as a close friend in Daytona Beach, where we both had moved. I got to know Lenny soon after Merlin had passed away, having lived in Daytona Beach for a while.
Carol, how did you get to know her?
I got to know her at a very early time. The book was published in 1976.
And you're talking about her book, when God Was a Woman.
That is correct. And so I thought it was a marvelous introduction. Her powerful voice, her daring. She had a very intrepid nature. She did her own research. She walked with a backpack. And I just fell in love with her perspective when God was a woman. You don't hear that very frequently in the United States of America. And we remain a patriarchal culture. And so she changed things radically at a time when there was also going on a wonderful feminist movement. And she just kicked it along. And it caught fire. And it was just like firecrackers. So you can't take anything away from what she did. It's enormous. She made an enormous change in American culture.
Lenny, you got to know her before her book was published in the United States. It had already been published in England.
That's correct.
Did you know who she was when you met her?
No.
How did you meet?
We met in Miami Beach. My mother lived in Miami Beach, and I went to visit my mother in late September of 1976. And I've always been an early riser, so I got up very early and I wanted to watch the sunrise. So I went down to the beach, and there was only one person on the beach, and it was Merlin. And she was meditating. She was in the lotus position, and she was facing the ocean, and her eyes were closed. And I sat there and watched her for about 15 minutes, and when she opened her eyes and started to move, I went over and started to speak to her. And we had a conversation, and she said that her mother lived in the same building that my mother lived in, and that she was in Florida because her father had dementia and her mother had been taking care of her, and it had become too much for her mother to do, so that she was there to help her mother. And we just kept talking, and I sort of liked her almost immediately, and I asked her if she wanted to go out that evening and see a movie and have dinner, and she said that she agreed, and she told me she lived across the street. She didn't live in the apartment building where her mother lived. And she gave me directions how to get to her apartment, and
the rest is history.
That's how it started. That's how it started. Yes.
How did this book originate for you? Was it you who wanted to tell her story, or was it a group decision?
Actually, I think Carol was the first one to mention it. Dave and I went to a poetry meeting at the Casements where Carol was the featured poet. And she was excellent that night, very feminist. So Dave said, you should speak to this woman. And I went over and spoke to Carol, and I started to talk about Merlin. And before I knew it, Carol was telling me more about Merlin than I knew about Merlin myself. And she said that we should try to write a book But Carol and I really weren't capable of writing a book. We needed
Well,
another.
Carol would have been, I'm sure.
We tried,
but somebody
but
stepped in.
yeah, no. Dave, after some persuasion, perhaps, agreed to help us, and that's how we finally came up with the idea. And it took about 3 years
Oh, wow.
from start to finish.
Most people think of a biography or a memoir as one person's organizing all the information. Why was it important that there be 3 different perspectives of her life, and really 4, because you also include her work as well in the book?
Well, and a wonderful woman named Gloria Orenstein who did the introduction for the book.
That's true.
And gave further historical perspective. I think the personal compulsion on my part is that Lenny had only just lost Merlin and was deeply saddened by, of course, watching her diminish and pass. And I suggested that writing his story of how he met Merlin and his life with her might be a good way to pay tribute to her, in addition to which he had to give a speech in September. We met in
there was a memorial for Merlin
early spring
in Clearwater, Florida, and Dave accompanied me there, and I did give a speech to about 100 feminists.
Tough crowd.
And Dave was fascinated with Merlin and what she had done, and when we were riding home, he came up with the idea that maybe we could expand on what I had said at the memorial and try to make it into a book. But my part of the book is really only like 60 pages of 330 pages, my life with Merlin, a memoir. The rest of it really is scholarly, her perspective of what she did. She was a fantastic sculptor, and she did fantastic sculptures all over Western New York. She had a letter from Robert Kennedy because her sculpture was in Robert Kennedy's office, and I had enough photos and information about Merlin so that we could actually compose a book. So we have a lot of interesting photos and unpublished writing, a lot of unpublished writing that had never quite gotten there. Women in Combat, for instance, and Intuition, which was a fantastic contribution to the book. So did take a long time, but it finally got done.
You talked about her work as a sculptor. She was like art professor. She did all
She
these
was an
amazing
art
things
professor.
before she even wrote the book. And Carol, can you explain to us what her book was about? The main one. She wrote several books, but the one When God Was a Woman, what that was about, and why it was so important to the feminist movement.
Very few women at that time, even though they were feminists, had the courage to go and prove what they were saying, is that we needed a female spirit in the country because it wasn't there. It was a complete patriarchy. So she got her little backpack and she went over and she got the proof that there had been many, many women's communities. How many thousands of years ago? 25,000? From 8 to 25,000 years. They were working. It was a very different perspective. It was cooperative. It was creative. And we need that now. And I think that's one of the reasons all of us are here, is that we need to hear what she had to say about cooperation, love, various Aristotelian notion of friendship. It's gone. And she did it. She said God was a woman, and only God could have created the world that we live in. It's so beautiful.
I think also how she went about tracking down the information
Yes.
as well. I mean, she went by herself
Alone.
with really no money, with, like you said, a backpack. I mean, she
Yep.
slept in caves. She traveled in places
Exactly.
that were not that friendly
She
to women.
didn't speak the language. She
Exactly.
had very little money.
And just to do that is just amazing. Do you know what spurred
I know
her
how
to
she
do that?
did it because she told me. She said that she was guided, and that a female energy in the universe told her where to go, what libraries to visit, even sometimes the page numbers in the books that she needed to read.
Oh, wow.
That it's the
She
truth.
reveals more of that in that unpublished essay, Intuition. where she does finally say that she could have a conversation, kind of an inner voice, that we're even attempting to dramatize as we write a little of kind of a dramatic treatment of her life.
Are you hoping to get that turned into something?
Well, for stage perhaps, but when we sold the book, they let us keep dramatic rights, so it's fetching to think that we could find the right combination of dramatic scenes that would explain her, let her speak in her own voice.
You did include, like you said, a lot of her published and unpublished writings in there. How important was that to help contribute to the reader's view of her?
Lenny is the ear to her papers and the copyrights of published work. So just to begin with, we got her unpublished novel, which is, even as a work of fiction, is indicative of her philosophy and thought process. I sent for her MFA thesis dissertation, in which she explained a lot more of her theories of art and how they led her to look for the goddesses who were so ignored in museums that she would find, or in sculptures or ancient artifacts. So doing that, the book actually became a source book of new material and new thoughts that we were able to put together for the public. I feel it's a source book as much as anything.
Okay, now here's an interesting question for all of you. How has Merlin Stone changed you? Lenny, why don't we start with you?
Well, last night I said everything I am, everything I became, and everything that I ever will be is because of Merlin. She absolutely transformed my life, my thought patterns, the way I see the world. I don't want to be too dramatic, but to say that I was a male chauvinist when I met Merlin, and I turned out to be a male feminist, which I'm very proud of. But one of the most interesting things that about Merlin was that she revealed herself and wanted you to know about her as we went, not the kind of person who said, I was a professor, then I did this, I used to be a sculptor, I went around the world. None of that actually came into
Her everyday conversation?
everyday conversation. When I met her, she was a switchboard operator in a hotel across the street from where our mothers lived. And that's who I thought I met for at least a couple of months. I thought I had met a switchboard operator because she didn't tell me that she just published this book, or that she had been a sculptor or a teacher or a professor.
It's
It was
interesting
very
that someone who is
She
so
was not-
interested in the history of women doesn't want to talk about her own history.
It was fascinating, but it was very interesting because she was so humble. Maybe she didn't want to shock me or overwhelm me. She just wanted me to like her for who she was and not for what she had been doing or done. While most other people would start to tell you, I was this, I was that, I did all of this, you should like me, because I have this past. It was a little different, she just revealed herself as she wanted me to know, and some things took years. In fact, I even have in the memoir that one time we went to a square dance, and she called the square dance. She couldn't dance the square dance, but she could call the dance.
That's not easy
Yeah,
either,
I
to
know,
dance it or to
right?
call it.
Right. Well, then you think that it would come up in 20 years, but it never came up. And then somehow we just wound up at a place where there was a square dance, and they let her call the dance.
Carol, how did Merlin Stone change you?
She changed me because you could accuse feminists of not being able to prove what they said.
Well, what kind of things were they saying that they weren't proving?
Well, if it's a patriarchy that women are second class, they still don't make as much as men. And so there are so many differences of inequality. And that was probably her greatest gift, was to say, wait a minute, I know a time when women were working on equality, cooperation, and creativity, and yes, it was a matriarchal, and matrifocal-centered community. So she proved it, and that's what was missing for the feminist movement. They said, oh, you're just saying that, you're making it up, you don't really know historically what happened. Well, she did the history, and she proved, in fact, that what the feminists, maybe perhaps it was intuition, but and they had found out in other ways, but she proved it. She went and got the evidence and brought it back, and it was just not disputable.
David, how did Merlin Stone change you?
Well, there are a lot of personal dimensions, not the least of which is that I had a very talented father who built stock cars and was a mechanic, and I was a poet. And I don't know how many people might remember Ernie Kovac's view of Percy Dove tonsils, the effeminate Coke bottle glasses, poet. And so for a young man to be a poet, or further through my life, men are also trapped by gender stereotypes. So for me, as I married and am now married to a wonderful professional woman, and I have 4 daughters of my children. I have 4 children. I have 3 daughters who are pursuing a professional life. I felt compelled to be a feminist for the reason that I wanted to be in touch with my own feminine side or creative side. And I wanted my wife and children to be accepted as full professionals. But to learn more and more about Merlin and understand origins of the goddess gave me more tools and more understanding and power. So now, if I was, if not so much compelled, but by default a feminist, now maybe I've made my bones. I've got more knowledge. Maybe I can now more justly claim that feminist, as Lenny is certainly a feminist among the men.
When people read this book about Merlin, what do you want them to take away from it? Lenny?
I'd like them to take away that women are equal to men, and that if they could just accept that men could accept that, we would have a much better world. We would have equal pay, we would have equal rights, we would have less rape, we would have more understanding of each gender. And she was all for that. She, in one of her writings, she said, perhaps it's only as simple as changing stereotypes. And that always resonated with me, because people are so locked into stereotypes that they can't really see a person other than the stereotypical notion that they have of people. And if they would just get to know the person themselves as opposed to the stereotype, they would have a much more solid understanding of each other. But I think the gender equality, I would like people to take that away, that perhaps God is not a man or a woman. In other words, Merlin also said that God would have to be mother and father to be creator. And perhaps if they just didn't believe that God is a woman or a man, and they would have a better gender equality. They just wouldn't be able to say God is made in my image and all of that.
Carol, what about you? What do you want people to take away from this book?
I think it was Virginia Woolf in Three Guineas, and she said what she wanted is what I think Merlin wanted as well, to know the difference between art and war, and to know the persons who are attracted to those two places. And that's what I would like from her, and I think she does that beautifully with the equality bit. And where are you? I mean, are you for art or war? And you will live in a different way depending on what you believe.
David, what about you?
Well, my colleagues have said so much and so well, and they are indeed so knowledgeable, that I hope it's not crass to say I'd like people to take away the book with them, honestly, because we did get a trifecta of reviews, Publishers Weekly, Library Journal, Kirkus, and I don't feel even so that people understand so much new material is there, gifted to us through Lenny and Carol, and I had the privilege of helping assemble it, even in some cases research, write it. But it really is a key book for people to rediscover Merlin or understand for the first time her own
philosophy.
favorite chapter from When God Was a Woman is reproduced there with Random House permission. And people who don't know Merlin can really learn so much valuable information. And people who do can rediscover her in new material. So I hope the book gets the attention that Merlin and these wonderful people deserve. And I wouldn't mind riding along with that.
It's a new genre, if you look at it. There's a love story, there's academic, there's her own writing, there's, I think part of a play is, her play is in there.
Interpretation of a novel.
A novel,
Yeah.
interpretation
Yeah.
of a novel. But I think there's so much there that it's a new genre, I submit.
I'd also like to mention that Merlin wrote a sister volume to When God Was a Woman titled Ancient Mirrors of Womanhood, which is also a fascinating and fantastic book. And Merlin just said it was information that was left over from When God Was a
No, it was
Woman.
more than that.
And
It was wonderful. Poetry celebrating the goddesses. Merlin herself actually wrote liturgy for goddesses, for important persona women from thousands of years ago who had been ignored, and now Merlin recreates the
Brought them back to
celebration
life.
of each of those spirits. So again, there's information in the book that I think we offer that people would find so opening and useful. I'm rooting for it. I'm rooting for Merlin. I'm rooting for Merlin.
Thank you.
And I think a lot of people will come away with a new perspective of her and
Yes.
an introduction to her, like you were saying. So it's definitely something people are going to find.
A lot of women who have said even though they knew Merlin, they still learned an awful lot about the kind of person that she was when they read the book. And I sort of like that also, that they just didn't know her as an author of When God Was a Woman or a champion of women's rights.
We play a little game, you know, and we walk into rooms where people don't know us, we don't know them, and we fit into the conversation. Or do you know anybody named Merlin Stone? Or the book When God Was a Woman? And if there isn't a sweeping, overwhelming wave of hands, there's always someone says, "Why, I know that book, and she changed my life."
Yes.
Yeah.
And so there's still a great
People jump
force
up and
movement.
say it.
Yeah, and that's a wonderful. And we have some letters to that extent that, and quite diverse. A minister who said in 1976, "I think you may open the clergy to women with your book." Ta-da! And kinds of appreciation of that kind.
Well, thank you all for coming here today
Well,
and
we
talking
thank
with us
you.
about this book in Merlin Stone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Florida Book Awards are presented annually to recognize, honor, and celebrate the best Florida literature. The program is coordinated by the Florida State University Libraries and co-sponsored by these groups that promote books by and for all Floridians.